Saul Sender, you're a corporate finance partner at Mishcon de Reya. Let's talk about shareholder activism. We've had what was called the Shareholder Spring. What's changed?
Well, this year's been a very interesting time to be a shareholder of a public company. Normally the annual general meeting season, often held in the spring, just goes by without many people noticing. And this year there's been a real groundswell of shareholder activism. Shareholders, when faced with a vote about companies' remuneration policy, this time they're indicating their dissatisfaction with the pay of directors and sometimes voting down resolutions to approve the remuneration report of listed companies.
Yet most of the headlines were about pay and boardroom pay. How much success did the shareholders have?
Well, if you look at shareholders on a legal basis, the success was very slight. Only four companies had a remuneration report voted down by shareholders at their annual general meeting. And actually in each of those 4 cases there was no legal obligation on the boards to change the remuneration policy because the vote is only instructive and not legally binding. However, if you look in the court of public opinion, you can really see a groundswell of shareholders saying, we don't like what's going on, we think some directors are being overpaid for the performance they're receiving, and sending a very strong message to boards that maybe they should rethink what they were putting to shareholders.
In your opinion, do you think, though, that that message, empty as it is perhaps at the moment without having any legal teeth, if you like, is that going to change? Are they going to change their ways at all?
I think in a lot of cases they have. And the way that the shareholdings of public companies work, it's often the message that's more important than the legal impact. So in a number of cases, CEOs have resigned or been forced to resign because a vote was taken where a significant minority voted against the report. So technically they didn't have to go, but actually it was a very strong indication from shareholders that what was going on wasn't right and they wanted some change.
Was it a blip, do you think, or is this the kind of behaviour that we're going to see more and more?
I think a lot of people in this country have a very genuine and very deep-seated concern that people who run companies are paid too much. And this comes a lot from people talking about the banks. Now, a lot of the banks took public money. They've not lent on the money they took from the government, and yet there's a perceived, a very real sense of failure, and yet directors' pay seems to be going up. So this has created very much a movement towards a society looking at how much people are paid and assessing is this fair. One emanation of this was the Occupy movement. It seems to have gone away at the moment, and many of the things that they advocated I don't think people would support in the city, and yet a lot of things they did say that things have got out of kilter struck a chord. And the Shareholder Spring is definitely one aspect of that. Other aspects of the causation of this are the multiplicity of media sources. When people have a message these days and shareholders want to get a message out to directors, they don't only have to wait till the AGM. They can get on their social media. They can use the many forms of media to start a campaign. So people can attack policies from a number of different angles. They can vote against it, they can ask for resolutions to be put to the company, and they can use the press to further their goals.
Do they have any power in a legislative sense? How has the legislative framework changed in order to support that shareholder power?
That's a good question. I mean, it's from the 2006 Companies Act, shareholders who own 5% of the equity of a company can require, in fact requisition, a meeting of the company to be held, and they can suggest the language, or in fact suggest that they can require the language of that resolution to be put to the shareholders of the company. Now they may or they may not be successful. That 5% can't necessarily give the 50% that you need to succeed, but they can really force their agenda on the company. And in certain circumstances they can require the company to send a circular to its shareholders setting out the reasons why they want to support the resolution. Normally this kind of resolution relates to the identity of the directors, because that's the easiest resolution to get through the process of approval through shareholders. And once your slate of directors has changed, then maybe those directors who come onto the board can affect or at least have a less entrenched position to the change that you want to advocate.
It very much feels as if shareholder activism is getting more credible, that it's no longer the preserve of troublemakers and nutters.
That's a very good observation. I mean, maybe 10, 15 years ago, anyone would want to avoid the moniker of shareholder activism because partly for that reason, and also they had a bad reputation for being entirely selfish and looking after their own goals. I think there has been a sea change in what the way the city as a whole has looked after shareholder activism. I think it's part of perhaps the new debate we've had about capitalism since the recession. I think people acknowledge that the capitalist system requires people to look after their own interests, and yet people are also accepting that there may be some beneficial consequences of that. I think what's important is that it's done in an open and honest manner. Shareholder activism really puts that to the fore because it puts debate that may have previously taken place in smoke-filled rooms in the city between fund managers, a very narrow world, and boards. Often they come from the same places and come from the same institutions. Whereas now, because shareholder activism is more out there, it's an open and multi-voiced debate. And I think that's good for any democracy, and our capitalist system kind of works off that debate, and the more of it, the better.
I mean, is there such a thing as a typical shareholder activist?
There isn't. I mean, they come in all colours and creeds. I mean, at one end of the spectrum, there are a number of ethical investors who've used shareholder activism as a means of furthering their agenda. For example, there was a group of activists who disagreed with, I think it was Shell's plan to extract oil from the wilderness in Canada. And they teamed up with some investment companies, and they used the requirements of the Companies Act to put a resolution to the board of Shell. And at the same time, they had an agenda of publicising it. And as it happens, Shell were very interested in listening to what they had to say, and then they reached some kind of agreement without necessarily putting it to the vote. So that was a very successful way of furthering an ethical cause. On the other hand, there are a number of hedge funds who are always, of course, looking to make a return for their investors. They look for undervalued companies, they take a stake, and they say, we want some change.
So why would a shareholder activist want to, or need to, use a lawyer?
Well, aside from being very user-friendly people, there's a number of reasons. I mean, firstly, activating the mechanisms that company law provides you. That's something that we do all the time, and we can advise shareholders on how best to use those powers. Secondly, when dealing with the media, you often have to tread a very fine line between making sometimes very strong and often personal statements about directors and their capabilities with the risk of defaming those directors. And we advise our clients on how to stay the right side of that line. Also, some shareholders have looked at litigating against the companies in which they have a stake. There is part of the Companies Act that allows shareholders effectively by proxy to require the company to take an action against its directors. Directors generally owe their duties to the company to act in the best interest of shareholders. If the company, as controlled by the directors, isn't willing to take that action, then in certain circumstances, shareholders can go to court and require the company to bring a claim against its directors. And that's another thing in the armoury of the shareholder activist.